"Excuse me, this line's for government clearance only," the officer said with a practiced smile. The kind that's designed to seem neutral while still pressing a message. Maya had been standing in that line silently, in the same spot for over 10 minutes. She hadn't cut. She hadn't spoken. She had simply existed, and that was already too much. She glanced behind her. No one else was questioned. No one else was asked. Only her. "I'm with the federal government," she answered calmly. "Priority status. Cleared for expedited processing." The officer raised an eyebrow, not to verify, but to challenge. "That right," he said, tone dipping. "You're with the government, yes," she answered. He laughed lightly, like she'd made a joke. "Lot of folks say that when they want to skip ahead. I'm not skipping. I'm following federal protocol." He didn't look at her ID. He didn't radio for verification. He looked at her coat, her natural hair pulled back into a bun, the skin she wore every day of her life. "Lady, you can't just say you're with the government. This line's for official business, not whoever shows up with confidence." She paused. "Measured. I can present credentials. That won't be necessary," he snapped. "You people always have some story about who you are." There it was. Not shouted, not even cruel on the surface. But in that phrase, "you people" was the whole weight of history. You don't belong here. You don't look the part. You don't pass the test. "Ma'am, please step aside. This is your final warning." Someone behind her sighed audibly. A man muttered, "Just follow instructions." Another voice whispered, "What's she trying to prove?" Still, the officer had not checked her documents, had not radioed anyone, had not spoken like this to the white man who walked through the same line just 3 minutes earlier, wearing flip-flops and a faded hoodie. Maya stood still, silent, calm, but not because she was okay, because she was calculating. He leaned closer. "Unless you have a magic badge in that bag, I suggest you move." She opened the flap of her coat, reached into a side pocket, pulled out a small black leather wallet, flicked it open. The badge glinted under the airport lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation, clearance level high, status active duty agent. The officer didn't speak, neither did Maya. She simply held it, stared at him, and waited for the color to drain from his face. "I'm Agent Maya Thompson," she said, voice quiet but firm. "And you've just profiled a federal officer on duty." The silence in the terminal wasn't awkward. It was judicial, and someone somewhere in that line was already uploading the video. Maya didn't say another word. She walked past him without breaking stride, her badge already tucked away, like it was just part of her coat, like it hadn't just exposed the kind of man he was in front of 50 silent witnesses. But silence doesn't mean peace. As she moved through the rest of security, picked up her shoes, adjusted her laptop, and collected her boarding pass, the ache in her chest remained sharp and centered. It wasn't because of what he said. It was because it wasn't new. She had been through this before. Different cities, different uniforms, same tone, same quiet doubt. The assumption that her skin spoke louder than her credentials. She didn't carry her badge for power. She carried it because the world kept asking her to prove she belonged. By the time she reached the gate, the incident had already been posted. A teenager nearby had caught the entire thing on their phone from the moment she was stopped, to the final reveal of her badge. The clip was short, but brutal. Imagine if she didn't have ID. The caption read, "It started with 100 shares, then thousands, then millions. A name wasn't even necessary. The video said everything. She boarded her flight to DOC in silence, headphones in, head down. As the plane lifted, her phone buzzed non-stop. Colleagues, friends, old classmates, messages poured in, some in disbelief, others in quiet apology. She didn't respond. She had a job to do, and this wasn't part of the plan. When she landed, a message from her bureau was already waiting. Please report to Compliance Office for review. Public exposure. Regarding recent incident requires internal assessment. No congratulations, no support, just an inquiry. To them, it didn't matter that she had been humiliated in public. What mattered was that now, so had they. 2 days later, Maya sat across a polished table from 2 internal affairs officers, both white, both stiff. They offered her water, asked if she was comfortable, then read from a script about optics, integrity, and public-facing behavior. They didn't ask how she felt. They asked why she didn't de-escalate, why she didn't quietly redirect the situation, as if the burden had been hers to shrink. She answered each question directly, carefully, like a woman who knew every word could be used against her. Then she signed the report, stood, and walked out. Not angry, just tired. The next morning, an envelope was waiting on her desk. No name on the front. Inside was a handwritten letter. He did the same thing to my son. Told him he looked too nervous to fly. Took him to a private screening room and humiliated him in front of strangers. He was 14. We had no badge to show. Thank you. That letter did more than move her. It confirmed something she had known all along. This wasn't personal. It was patterned. So she filed a request, not a complaint, a request for a review of all civilian reports filed against Airport Officer Craig Benson in the last 5 years. She didn't need to prove he was a racist. She just needed to prove the system never asked. Maya didn't react publicly. She didn't post. She didn't retweet. She didn't make a statement. But she was watching. Every view, every comment, every news anchor who used the word composure to describe how she handled humiliation as if it were a talent. She wasn't flattered. She was calculating. Within 72 hours, the video had hit 5 million views. A petition had started calling for the termination of Officer Craig Benson, citing racial profiling and abuse of authority. Activists began digging into his history. But Maya already had a head start. She'd requested the records herself, every complaint filed against him, every internal review dismissed with phrases like insufficient evidence or no clear misconduct. The patterns were undeniable. The language, consistent. Most complaints were from black or brown travelers. All of them ended the same no follow-up, no consequence. She also found something else, a staff memo dated 6 months prior, casually noting Benson's strict style as a positive trait. Strict style. That was the code they used when someone knew how to walk the edge of policy while stepping all over people. That's how it's protected, not through lies, but through language. At the same time, the media had its own arc. First outrage, then curiosity, then fatigue. They moved on. But Maya didn't. She had no interest in TV interviews or panels on race and security. What she wanted was accountability, and she knew better than to wait for someone to hand it to her. She met quietly with a former instructor, now a deputy director in internal security review. Over coffee, she slid him a folder of documents, patterns, redacted memos, everything she'd collected. He looked through it, slowly, expression unreadable. Finally, he asked, "Do you want to open a case?" Maya didn't blink. "I want oversight, a real audit, from outside the airport authority. You know this means visibility," he warned. "Not just for him, for you, too." She looked him dead in the eye. "Visibility's never protected me, but transparency might protect someone else." He nodded, took the folder, and promised to elevate it. That same week, she received 2 calls. One was from HR, reminding her to consider the broader implications of pushing too hard, too fast. The other was anonymous. "A woman's voice. I worked with Benson 3 years ago. I saw how he treated black women. I filed a complaint. They transferred me instead of him." Each step Maya took confirmed the same truth. Craig Benson wasn't just a bad officer, he was a protected one. And those protections didn't come from rogue decisions. They came from a system built to absorb moments like hers, explain them away, and keep moving. But this time, the video didn't fade. The story didn't vanish, because Maya wasn't waiting for justice. She was building a case. In a closed-door briefing, her file reached the attention of a federal oversight board, and that's when it happened. Not a press conference, not an arrest, but something quieter and more dangerous. The Department of Homeland Security announced a sudden internal audit into bias-related complaints in airport security. No names, no direct acknowledgement. But everyone who had been watching the story knew what it meant. The system was shifting, not by choice, but by force, and for the first time. Maya didn't feel alone in the room. The moment the audit was announced, things began to move, but not where the public could see. There were no headlines naming Craig Benson, no press releases confirming what everyone suspected. Just quiet phone calls, rushed meetings, and an unusual number of temporary reassignments across airport security departments in 3 major cities. But Maya saw the ripples. She saw the way patterns got protected not by hiding them, but by dispersing them just enough to avoid accountability. In private, she received messages from people she'd never met, TSA agents, former employees, passengers who never went viral. One had been pulled aside for looking too tense. Another was told her hair needed additional screening. One father said his 10-year-old son was strip-searched because he fit a profile. None of it made the news, but all of it was part of the same problem. Maya cataloged everything, not out of revenge, but to understand the scope. What she found wasn't surprising. What shook her was how normalized it had become. The internal reports used phrases like reasonable discretion, officer judgment, and safety protocol to excuse almost every incident. In this system, racism wasn't documented, it was translated into paperwork. One internal memo from 3 years earlier referenced a traveler's complaint about Benson directly. The reviewer wrote, "He may need a refresher in cultural sensitivity, but his record is otherwise strong. No training was assigned, no follow-up recorded." Another memo mentioned Maya by name, flagging her as a subject of media attention and advising limited engagement. That was the response. Not reflection, not accountability, just avoidance. And yet, something else began to happen. A junior analyst at the Department of Transportation requested a copy of Maya's collected file. A month later, her materials were cited in a closed-door Senate briefing on racial disparities in airport enforcement. No cameras, no applause. But the message was clear. The story had breached the walls. Meanwhile, Craig Benson had been quietly placed on administrative leave. The agency didn't confirm it, but his absence was noticed. His co-workers began whispering about the incident, some saying he was unlucky, others saying he had pushed the wrong one. No one called it what it was, but they all knew. And for Maya, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had been humiliated and told to just let it go. Every passenger who had to choose between silence and escalation. Every officer who had to watch, afraid that speaking out would cost them their job. So she made a decision. She requested to join a task force, one buried deep inside the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, designed to review patterns of misconduct across federal transportation. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She asked for records, access, a seat in the rooms where policies are written and where people like Benson are shielded by language. This wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. And now, she was inside it. It didn't happen overnight. There were no viral videos this time, no sharp headlines, no hashtags echoing across timelines. But inside the bureaucracy, inside the very system that once tried to silence her, Maya had become a builder. Quiet, methodical, relentless. The task force meetings were small, the kind where no one takes photos, and everyone speaks in low voices because they're not sure if what they're saying will survive the next budget cycle. But Maya showed up every week with documentation, with patterns, with names that had been ignored and reports that had been buried under layers of policy speak. She wasn't asking for apologies. She was drafting new policy language line by line. She pushed for changes in officer evaluation standards, introduced a clause that would require review of any pattern of repeated complaints, even if each individual case was dismissed. She fought for inclusion of traveler racial demographics in security data reporting, something that had never been formally tracked before. She proposed training that wasn't just about sensitivity, but about accountability training with consequences. And slowly, things moved. The Department of Homeland Security issued a memo announcing the implementation of a new bias review protocol in 3 major airports as part of a pilot program. A quiet step, but a measurable one. One of Maya's proposed clauses made it into the new draft policy, though her name wasn't mentioned. That didn't matter. She wasn't building it for credit. She was building it for the girl in the handwritten letter, for the boy pulled out of line for looking too alert, for every person who didn't have a badge to flash, a camera to capture, or a system that believed them, internally. Some officers began pushing back, grumbling about being policed for doing their jobs. Others welcomed the clarity. For the first time, there was a framework, a set of rules for power, the kind Maya had never seen used to protect her. Craig Benson never returned to his position. No statement was issued. No blame was assigned. But he quietly filed for early retirement, and the airport began recruiting new supervisors with an emphasis on inclusive enforcement standards, bureaucratic language. But behind it, a signal something broke open, and it wasn't closing back up. Maya never celebrated. She didn't throw her badge on a table or look into a camera and say she won. That's not how accountability feels. It feels like silence, like the absence of the next Benson, like walking through security and not being stopped, not because they recognize your name, but because no one has to defend their dignity in the first place. She stayed in her role. No press, no book deals, just the next memo, the next meeting, the next clause. She wasn't the face of change. She was its architect.